also traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. To understand atheist and agnostic as well.
Hey, Preston.
Hi, Katie.
How are you?
I'm good.
On this blessed day, Sunday.
It is. It's a good day for Christianity.
Did you go to Mass this morning?
Mass? No.
Well, we're going to take you to Mass today on
the Holy Watermelon Podcast.
I mean, we're not, but we're talking about Catholicism, so.
Yeah.
That was my week. My week opening.
I don't know if you want to call it that.
No. Intro. My week intro.
That's better.
That's way better.
Oh, no.
So today we're going to deep dive into a specific denomination of Christianity, Catholicism, or as they call themselves, the OG.
There's probably some people who will say that, but I don't think that's an official label of the church.
Okay, fine.
Oh, well. So we've talked about Christianity before a few times in a lot of different aspects of practices and whatnot. But we decided this time it would be cool to talk about that church that claims to be the original. As you will see in the course of this episode, there will be some issues with that. But we could only find the history that remains recorded.
Thank you. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi.
Yep.
He taught some things that made other rabbis really angry, as well as the government.
Yep.
He was publicly and gruesomely executed.
Yeah, he had a really bad night followed by a really bad day.
Now, that was pretty standard in the Roman Empire, though.
A gruesome execution?
Yeah.
Or having a bad time?
I mean, those sound like one and the same to me, but crucifixion was pretty common.
Yeah.
And witnesses reported him seeing alive again just a few days later.
So let's talk about some of those witnesses. I went and studied the apostles. He had hundreds and hundreds of disciples. Students is a good synonym for disciple. But he had his core council of 12 apostles that were the leadership of the church. All these many, many students that surrounded him. 2 of them were his brothers. He also had other brothers. They didn't make it into the club. But his closest students, his apostles, he gave code names to them. And I think that's really interesting. So we had, of his brothers, Judah, son of Joseph, and Simeon, son of Joseph, were each given interesting nicknames. Yaakov and Yusuf, his other 2 brothers, no cool nicknames, no fancy title. So Judah was called Toma, which means twin. You see this adapted into the modern language we enjoy today as Thomas. Also, Didymus is the Greek equivalent.
Is this Doubting Thomas?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a lot of mystery around why he was called the twin. Who was it he looked like? The Gospels that we have in the Bible don't tell us, but other books that didn't make it into the Bible will straight out say he was almost identical to Jesus physically. So he was the twin of Jesus.
But not twin in the way we two babies at the same time. That would wreck the nativity story.
Or at least complicate it a lot. Yeah.
Here's 2. One of them's God and one of them's not. You'll have to figure out which.
Right. That would have been a problem.
Yeah.
For a lot of
I mean, by
people.
the time he was 12 and killing and resurrecting teachers, we would have known which one.
Right. Yeah. This one's the problem child, and then we've got Judah, who's just fine. According to the infancy gospel of Thomas.
Amazing.
So maybe he was the oldest of Jesus' brothers. You get too much age difference, and it's pretty obvious that they're not at all twin-like.
Right.
Then there was the next brother, Simeon, who was given this code name or nickname of Cana, which meant zealot. So there's a reasonably popular book out there by Reza Aslan that paints Jesus as one of the zealots, this revolutionary group. And with a nickname like this, maybe Simeon legit belonged to that group.
In Jesus Christ Superstar. My favorite song is Simon Zealot.
This is
Simon.
the guy.
Okay.
Weirdly enough, that word kana that translates to zealot is sometimes erroneously translated as Canaanite.
Because it sounds the same.
It's a little similar, yeah. Part of the trouble is the way the word was transposed into Greek. So in addition to these two brothers that made it into this group of 12, we got 10 other guys. Most famously is Kepha, who is not popularly known by this name. Good old Simon, son of Jonah, famously known as Peter today, or Rocky, I think, is a perfectly reasonable alternative, because Kepha, the name that Jesus actually gave him, and is often recorded in English Bibles in a way that convinces people to pronounce it Cephas. It's Cephas through the Greek and Latin.
Okay, yeah, I've seen that.
But the good old Aramaic Hebrew word was Kepha, which means stone. So that's how you get Peter and Rocky as reasonable translations in other languages. He may have been the oldest of the 12. That seems like a pretty easy way to get seniority in this group, but maybe not. His younger brother, we know him as Andrew in English, would have been an Andreas in Greek. That might have been the code name. It might have just been his name when doing business with Greeks. It's definitely not his original Hebrew name, but we don't actually know the deal with his nickname situation.
Okay.
Then we've got a couple other guys. We've talked about these guys before, Jimmy and Johnny Thunder.
Yeah.
We've got Yohanan, son of Zebediah, and Yaakov, son of Zebediah. Jesus gave them both the same nickname, Ben Rajesh. The Greek says Boanerges, which, if you're not seeing a theme, Greek does a really bad job of transliterating Hebrew words.
I see that, yeah. Yeah, I'm getting that.
We know them as James and John today. And they, with Peter, good old Kepha, were like the special three that got to witness all of the best miracles. We've got Philip. We might never know who he is. It might have been his Greek business name. It might have been a translation of a nickname that Jesus would have given him. The name Philip means horse lover. And that's about all we know. Ask the question that's on your mind, Katie, because I can see it on your face.
No, it's not meant for this podcast. Like, I say some pretty bad things, but I'm not going to mention Mr. Hands in this episode. Don't look that up.
Yeah.
If you don't know what Mr. Hands is, don't look it up.
Yeah. Presumably, like Andreas, it may have been a Greek business name.
Right.
But we'll probably never legit know for sure. Next, we have a fellow named Nathaniel. By deduction from the different lists that we have in different Gospels, we can equate this Nathaniel with the one who was codenamed Bartolome, which is a tricky name. It either means son of the furrows or son of Ptolemy, which is a really good imperial power name, which feels less likely to have been used by Jesus, but hard to rule it out with certainty. Then we got Levi, son of Halphe. He was given the nickname Mattiyahu. We get Matthew from that name. The name means gift of God. Then presumably his brother. It seems like we've got another Yaakov, another James. James the Just is this fella. We've got Yaakov Zadok. Zadok was that nickname, which either refers to Sadducee loyalty, which, I mean, that's irregular in this group. We would have had mostly Pharisees connections here. Or the name means some sort of self-righteousness or general righteousness. So could have a few different sets of baggage with this name. And then we've got Judah, son of Yaakov. He was given the name Taddai, which means heart, and we get the name Thaddeus from that. And then we have Judah, son of Simeon, or Simon. He was given the name Ishkariot, which means the man from Kerioth, because he's not from where the other guys are from. Everybody else is from the northern province that we know today as Galilee. This guy is from much closer to Jerusalem, and so he's naturally an outsider. From the very beginning, he was not really part of the in-group. He's always listed last, presumably because he's the traitor, though some suggest that he might have been the
Judas
younger one.
Iscariot.
Yeah.
Iscariot.
Yes.
There it is.
Perfect. You caught up.
Yeah. I am picking up what you're laying down.
Perfect. So I just think it's really interesting that they had code names. And you'll see later on that this is a continuing theme in the Catholic tradition.
Do you have any nicknames?
I've got a good handful of nicknames. Most people don't use them very often.
Mm-hmm. Can you give me one? What's your favorite nickname?
Favorite nickname? I don't know. People call me Presto a bunch sometimes.
Presto Changeo.
Yeah. That comes up a lot. My boss calls me P-Money, and I'm pretty sure that's not a good thing.
No, that doesn't sound great.
Yeah, I don't know. I've got one of those names that isn't terribly common, but it isn't super weird to hear. And so I usually just get that. If I was Mike, I'd probably need a nickname. Just because there's so many Mikes out there.
That's fair.
I have a lot of Mikes in my phone.
Hi, Mike.
All right. So of these, Judas is said to have killed himself shortly after Jesus' execution. It's unclear how this news came to the other apostles, but it seems to be pretty rumor heavy because we have different versions of his death that are, I'm going to say, hardly compatible with each other. Not completely incompatible, but you got to do some work to make them the same story.
Does he kill himself in all 4 Gospels?
No.
Okay, so then it's not even confirmed.
But the remaining apostles decided, well, we've got this Council of 12. We're going to keep it that way because it's great. And so they immediately filled the vacancy when they found out that, well, I don't know if they waited until they found out Judas was dead or if they're like,
you betrayed him.
This relationship we have with Judas isn't really going to work out for us, so we're going to let him go and we're going to replace him. It could be either way, but we got a fella to fill in his spot, and off the top of my head, I can't remember his name right now because I didn't write it down, and now it's gone.
Not Paul.
It wasn't Paul.
Paul never met the apostles.
Oh, yeah, he did. But he never met Jesus while Jesus was alive, as far as we're aware. His story doesn't...
But there's no way he didn't meet all the apostles because of just they spread out so much.
They spread out, but they did gather. CE, there was a council that brought all the apostles back to Jerusalem, and Peter was still around as the lead of that, and Paul showed up to attend that.
They got in a fight.
They were definitely on different sides of an argument. At least to begin with.
So as I just alluded to, each of the 12 presided over missions to various areas to help establish churches, not quite around the world, but around the part of the world they knew.
Yeah, all over the Roman Empire they traveled, and even beyond those borders a little bit too. Good old Kepha Peter went to Lydia, Joppa, and Caesarea, and then he went off to Antioch after that, where he presided as episcopi, which is a great Greek word that just means overseer or supervisor, but we usually translate that word to bishop.
Jimmy Thunder, James, likely went to do the same in Spain, but he was executed early in church history. Most of the apostles didn't really meet great ends.
No, most of them met gruesome ends. When good old Jimmy Thunder came back from Spain, he was executed by the sword, which is better than crucifixion, I guess.
And he's faster, which is nicer.
Yeah.
If you got to go. So the Christian Bible is more than a little fuzzy on the succession of the new apostles after Jacob's execution. The construction of Lucas' Acts of the Apostles suggests that Saul of Tarsus, known to the Romans as Paul, took his spot, though it seems unlikely, considering how they selected Iscariot's.
Rule was that we want somebody who was already a student of Jesus when he was alive and was a witness to his miracles. Paul did have a miraculous vision. That may have been enough to get him into the group, but it isn't following the rules that they had previously set up. So while Paul is often called an apostle, we actually get a bunch of people who were later on called apostles that weren't in that core council of 12.
Right.
So it gets fuzzy.
And that's throw a wrench in our show notes. But I've also heard that they removed the female apostles out of history. There's some debate on people like Eunia.
Well, the trick is what really was an apostle.
Right.
Yeah. Missionaries, just broadly, were called apostles pretty loosely in early Christian writings. Weird. Yeah. But we don't have reliable record of there ever being women in that core council of 12, but we do have reliable record of lady missionaries, even in the biblical text.
After the apostolic conference, nearly 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion, Kepha Peter went to Rome and presided over the mission there.
Yeah, and then this was like a really important part of our history because Rome. Now we have a seat in this town of power, and apparently letting go of that is a problem. So apostles and other Christian leaders also, unfortunately, had a little bit of a struggle with the culture around them. And they made a habit of defying demands for sacrifices to imperial gods. And this would often get them killed.
Yeah.
And thus more vacancies in the council. And we really don't have a whole lot of details on those vacancies being filled. So apostolic succession for leadership is a thing that is it's understood differently in different groups. There's a biblical passage that is super important to the Roman Church, and other churches will look at it differently because it needs to be interpreted in different ways for various claims of power.
So this is where we see the Catholic Church versus like a Presbyterian model versus an
Episcopalian.
Thank you.
Is that the word you're after?
That is, yeah.
Okay.
Model. Is that?
A little bit. So there's a verse in the Gospels where Jesus is asking the apostles, who am I? Who do people say I am? Who do you think I am? And Peter says, well, you're the Son of God. And Jesus says, the Spirit taught you this. You are Kepha, which means stone. And upon this rock I will build my church. So it's widely understood that, in the Catholic Church at least, that Peter is the rock that the church is built on. And it feels a little bit weird because Peter is a human who can swing wildly between drawing blood to help a friend or denying that same friend publicly.
I don't know him.
Yeah. So saying that he is personally the foundation of the church instead of, say, Jesus, God, the principle of revelation, and that somehow that means that the king of a place where he once taught about Jesus gets to have a monopoly on that whole deal just feels weird. I think there's a better way.
I mean, it wouldn't be the weirdest thing in Catholicism.
That's correct.
So in the beginning, I don't know if you know this, in the beginning, that's how it starts.
Mm-hmm.
There was a council of apostles under the presidency of Simon Peter, Kepha Peter. This council lost its president about 64 CE when Nero thought it would be a great idea to crucify Peter. And it makes sense that the next senior member of the council would have a good shot at being appointed or elected to that office, presumably being a witness of Christ.
Makes sense to me.
Also, I will point out that Peter was crucified upside down.
Yeah, he really didn't want to be crucified in the same way that Jesus was. He didn't feel he was worthy.
It's, you know what? Of all the things, don't worry about that one.
Right?
You know? Much is lost in our history. Contemporary details are sparse about the succession in the council. The next head of the church, according to the Church of Rome, was not part of that council, but instead a fellow who might have overseen the congregation of Rome after Peter.
Yeah, might have.
Might have.
Papist authorities say that Kepha and Paul together gave the bishopric to Linus. A little fuzzy on those details, too. The oldest witness we have for Linus even being Bishop of Rome, reliably, dates to 180
So well after
CE.
he would have been dead.
Long after he was dead. If Peter moved away from overseeing a specific mission or congregation or whole ecclesiastical region before his death, then universal or Catholic leadership, the universal and Catholic, same word, that leadership would not reasonably be tied to that location, I think. I mean, it would have still followed wherever Peter ended up, right? He died in Rome, so that's something. The idea that has been perpetuated is that Rome was the seat of power, and thus the boss in Rome is the boss of everyone. You would be right to assume that this idea did not sound right to everybody.
It is kind of weird how, like, even to this day, Rome is the seat of power for the Catholic Church. And you can have a man from South America literally be the president of a country he was never born in.
Right. I mean, America is one of many countries that have a very strict rule of if you're not born here, you don't get to be president.
I know. I was trying to figure out how many countries have that rule, because the Vatican is clearly one exception where you can be from anywhere in the world.
It's a global democracy.
It's a global democracy.
Not that it's not flawed.
Well, and it's not really a democracy because you have to be a bishop to vote.
Yeah. I mean, it's still a semi-democratic system.
Yes.
But yeah, they're not just going to elect little Susie, who's 12, in Canada.
Right. But like, even if you're a woman and a public resident of the Vatican, you wouldn't be allowed to vote.
Right.
Even if you live in the Vatican City, because they do have a handful of public residents, unless you're a bishop, you don't get a vote.
Right.
And then you could be from anywhere and be a bishop. And it's wild. Anyway, we'll get into the Holy See in a little bit later. But
yeah. It's just different than the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's a special little pocket that not everyone agrees with, which was the point we were trying to make.
Yeah. So imperial tradition is the power behind the Catholic claim of apostolic succession. The idea that whoever is bishop of Rome, which presumably started with Linus after Peter, gets to be the top dog. It's weird and doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense to me.
I mean, it is interesting how history unfolded that way.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it's interesting that's an imperial tradition, because when we think of imperial traditions, we think of like a monarchy.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a monarchy.
It is, but none of these people can have kids. So you have to...
According to current laws. The whole no kids thing wasn't there in the beginning.
Oh, right. That was Vatican II?
Oh, no.
And further back than that.
Much further back than Vatican II that said they weren't allowed to have kids.
But... yeah, Vatican II was in the 50s, wasn't it?
60s. Yeah.
But it's just like weird to have an imperial tradition that isn't like
worried about
heir.
dynasties.
It's heir hierarchy. Yeah.
Hierarchy is not the word you're after.
What's when you have heirs?
Dynasties. Yeah. Legacies.
Yeah.
It's not really the same word either. I think dynasty is what you're after. Yeah. So eventually everybody who knew a living Jesus was gone. Before that, people had already started trying to figure out how what they already believed worked into this new Christian theology that was being delivered by these missionaries. And so they would incorporate all kinds of fun little things that got to be called heresies.
Yay. Let's burn some heretics.
Yeah, it's quite the extreme response.
I mean, we'll burn heretics for centuries.
Yeah.
It's really only in the last probably 200 years that we stopped burning heretics. Maybe even less than.
I feel like it's
we definitely
been longer than that. Hasn't it?
I mean, I'm sure we burned a heretic or two in the 1800s.
There were witches that were burned.
Heretic.
Mostly in Europe. We hanged them here in North America. Yeah, I guess the witches could qualify as heretics. I mean, basically, if you say out loud that you believe something that the rest of the group doesn't, or you practice in some sort of way that the rest of the group is like, oh, that looks like witchcraft, you're going to have a bad time. Yeah. And there got to be a lot of arguments early on in the church about all these different ideas.
Oh, we'll touch on some of them, not all of them.
Yeah, I don't have time for everything today.
Or we would just have a Catholic podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's start with the early history of the church. So because of the infrastructure of the Roman Empire with its vast network of roads, lots of trade, and the widespread use of the Greek language, Christianity actually spread quite quickly. Most success was found in converting Jews to Christianity, just like we see with any new denomination. And by the year 100 CE, there was more than 40 established Christian communities on the Mediterranean Sea.
It's not so bad.
I mean, yeah, that's pretty good.
Christians, when they're minority groups, have historically been pretty all right. It's when they get power that becomes a problem.
Missionaries went nearly everywhere in the empire before the end of the first century. Some apostles even went into lands today known as India, Ukraine, Spain, and Ethiopia.
Long walk for a lot of these guys.
Long walk, camel ride.
Yeah, I mean, ideally Spain would be a boat trip, much faster than walking. But
You'll have to walk some
Ethiopia, probably not on boat. Getting to Ukraine, probably not all on boat. So, in the early years, Christianity was referred to as Jewish Christianity. These Jews who believed the Messiah had finally come. This was when Jews and Christians would worship side by side, and Christianity was more of a sect or offshoot of Judaism, not recognized as fully its own thing yet. But once Gentiles started converting to Christianity, because Christians were really preaching.
Very persuasive people.
Yeah. At least at this early point in history, that was the trick, rather than persuasion of the sword, which came later. The division between Christianity and Judaism became more defined. It got to the point where Christians weren't meeting in synagogues anymore. They were being pushed out as the people who were convinced Jesus could not be the Messiah said, if you believe that, you can't meet here anymore. That and showing up in other places across the empire, we got more house churches until they started building their own churches, good old chapel halls, things like that. So after the Council of Jerusalem in about 50 CE, it was decided that Gentiles wouldn't have to be circumcised, and they wouldn't have to hold up all of these laws that the Jews were previously beholden to. This was not popular with everybody, though the Greeks felt pretty good about it.
Fair.
But yeah, the Jewish population, some of them were relieved not to have to worry about it. Others are like, no, this is the way we do it. And what you're saying is not okay.
There's a pretty good defining moment.
Yeah.
Now between two religions as opposed to a denomination.
Yeah. Yeah. And Christianity became more and more different as it brought in more Greeks and Romans and people from across the empire who brought with them their own theological baggage and weird ideas about what God looks like. Ideas like the demiurge of what we call today the Gnostic tradition. Not super compatible with the gospel Jesus was teaching, but people found a way to kind of jam them together into a product that is certainly interesting to read about. We really should do a Gnosticism episode. I feel like we've been saying this for a long time.
We should get our good friend Glenn back for it.
I think that'd be great. So anyway, all kinds of fun philosophies came in, inspiring all kinds of books that did not make it into the Bible for what I think most people will count as very good reasons. Before the end of the first century, Christianity was nearly as diverse as it is today, except assembling under fewer banners than today. We see a lot of different church names and titles and whatnot.
Yeah, and some of this and timelines obviously will vary, but especially as, I think of as they get into places like Scandinavia and the British Isles, well, for it to even be palatable to these people, they had to incorporate some of the mysticism of their existing faith. So this is where you get the start of a very broad belief in Christianity.
And with it, more heresies.
Yay! As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, they were persecuted because they didn't toe the line with the existing polytheistic pantheon. Because Christianity is strictly monotheistic, and we'll talk about the Trinity in a minute, Christians were required to reject all other deities. None of this henotheism where they're allowed to coexist.
Right.
This concerned people that the Christians were angering their gods, and you don't want to make Demeter the goddess of the harvest or Ares the god of war.
Yeah, if you're not helping with all of the things that make the empire good, it doesn't take much for you to be an enemy of the state.
Yeah. This started to change when Constantine, he was the first Roman Empire to convert to Christianity. He legalized it in 312 CE. In the Edict of Milan. And Constantine also gave the church land, money, and tax exemptions. So while this didn't change the public's opinion on Christianity yet, it did help the church thrive. But he was concerned with how much variation there was in Christian beliefs. And
certainly so were all of his counselors.
and he was worried it would upset God. I wonder what he'd think about us now. I wonder what he'd think of prosperity gospel. So this led to the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE.
So over the course of 3 months, bishops met in Nicaea, now Iznik, Turkey, to create some consistency in Christianity. This meant lots and lots of arguing and lots of actual physical violence. We had a lot of big names come up that aren't even important today, but we can certainly talk about them later when we talk about good old heresies in its own focused episode. But Christology, the specific branch of theology that focuses on Jesus and who he is, was the hot button topic. It's hard to say how many bishops showed up. Somewhere between 250 and 300 from all over the known world converged on Nicaea. It's pretty small compared to the number of people who were invited. Everybody was supposed to show up to have this huge argument, because that's what it was. So while everybody in attendance is said to have agreed on the Nicene Creed, and maybe they did, maybe they didn't, it feels like it was some pretty reluctant agreement there for some of these guys.
Right, I did say they agreed happily, but we had the Nicene Creed, so...
Yeah, there are approximately 1,500 more bishops out there who did not show up for this council.
Also, it's actually wild to me that this is 1,700 years old. You can thank the Council of Nicaea for the confusing date of Easter. Not only did they decide how divine Christ was, they decided, can you imagine these Greeks a bazillion years ago being like, you know what a good date for Easter would be? The first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox.
Sounds like witchcraft.
Sounds like witchcraft. Sounds like horoscopes. Sounds like just, can you imagine how many times they'd have to tell people? Like in those first few years? Mm-hmm. No, guys, it's not this. I know it was the 15th last year, but this year it's a week later because it's the first Sunday after the first full moon, after spring equinox. So it's actually on the 22nd this year, guys.
It sounds so nonsensical, but I like it for one reason. It's the best they could do to make any sense at all of comparing their calendar to what the Hebrews had.
Yeah. Fair. And this have been the Gregorian calendar because we also have the Julian calendar.
No, this would have been the Julian calendar. Okay. Gregorian's newer.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Gregorian's what we use today. And the Julian calendar is what they were using then, that a lot of people stuck with a lot longer than the rest of us.
Right.
We switched to the Gregorian calendar long before the Russians did, for example.
But yeah, there you go. So when you're like, when's Easter? You can hold your fist in the air and go, Council of Nicaea. Also share it with your family at Easter dinner because fun facts.
Right. Well, we just don't have a lunar calendar. We have a solar calendar. And our Jewish friends use a lunar calendar. So with the help of Constantine, the church became an imperial power all on its own, kind of, with the help of Constantine. So the tricky thing is a bishop who receives confession from the emperor really couldn't be trusted to answer to a higher human authority. So it was really important to keep the head of the church in Rome rather than worry about having your local bishop respond, like just share secrets, which might account as state secrets outside those borders.
Right.
Not a really great plan. But with the fall of Rome, the church ended up being the greatest influence for peace in Europe and Western Asia. And when you look at history, that's not saying a lot. But it did help unify a lot of these lords and kings and whatnot. So there's something.
It made it a little bit better than it was before. You got to walk before you can run.
I mean, Pax Romana was a big deal. It was expected that you could travel all across the continent in safety. I don't know if that was really true in practice, but that's what's advertised. I think they said the same of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan. So these same systems that allowed the quick communication of new ideas was used to police heresy. Several groups splintered away from the Church of Rome over the centuries, though, and most of them deserve their own episode. I don't think we have time today to get into these splintered groups. We'll stick to the Imperial Church.
The Catholic Church jealously guarded their monopoly on Scripture. Heroes, Preston, like St. Thomas More and Guy Fawkes, worked to prevent the publication of the Bible in English, to keep people in church and not trying to understand the Word of God on their own.
Heroes.
Heroes.
The church has since changed their mind about that policy. Now you're allowed to have a Bible in your home that you can read.
So he was sainted.
Yeah, good old Thomas More. We've talked about him before.
He was in our very first saint that shouldn't be saints because he
shouldn't be a saint.
He really shouldn't be sainted. But that's fine.
Yeah.
Everybody still loves Guy Fawkes, forgetting what he was actually trying to accomplish.
Yeah. I feel like I've mentioned this on the show before. His goal was to blow up Parliament so that they would not approve the publication of the Bible. I feel like that's a really important detail that's left out of the V for Vendetta story.
Yeah, it's not just anarchy. I guess it's a little bit of anarchy.
A little bit. Government should be afraid of their people. Or, according to real life Guy Fawkes, the government should be afraid of the church. Which is an idea that's getting more popular in a lot of places today. Unfortunately. You'll see a lot of this in America, and you'll see a lot more and more of it as the years go on, I think.
Since the Vatican II Council, the Church has decided to not be deliberately out of reach for the common man. Mass can be performed in the common language of the people instead of in Latin.
Yeah, more forward progress. It's great.
Yay!
I think it's important that people be able to understand a thing in this meeting that they're all agreeing to.
Mass is long enough as it is. Could you imagine not understanding a word of it?
Sleep time. And hope you recognize the cues to stand up. So the authority in the Catholic Church is with the bishops. Priests and deacons are basically just assistants to those bishops. And they have a lot of work to do. And the bishops just get to enjoy their comfy chairs.
I want to be a bishop.
Right?
I'm not allowed.
No.
I'm a woman.
You could be an Anglican bishop.
Yes. The Catholic world is divided into dioceses, and each diocese is overseen by a bishop.
Some of these dioceses are more important than others, and they get the fantastic honor of being archdiocese.
Ooh,
I think we're really close here to getting that boost.
Interesting. The most recent number I could find there is that there were 2,248 dioceses as of 2021. So these are
just a few years old.
Yeah. Dioceses are then divided into parishes, which are staffed by priests and deacons.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky, which these are interesting stats to me.
Because we've got, 20% of parishes don't have priests?
About 20, almost 20% of parishes don't have priests. So I forget which episode we talked about this on.
I feel like we talked about it with...
the sex abuse one?
Probably.
I think it might have, yeah.
And I feel like the subject, we talked about it with Frank as well.
Yeah, but anyway, the Catholic population isn't actually shrinking, but the priests are being stretched thin. They can't actually serve their parishes.
It's not getting more interesting to be a priest.
Yeah, so the priest per capita is decreasing, which is interesting. And then I thought this was fascinating. Like any good bureaucracy, the Catholic Church is top heavy. There are over 5,300 bishops worldwide. So 20% of their dioceses, there's only 2,200 dioceses and 5,300 priests. 5,300 bishops. And 400 of their parishes don't have priests. Doesn't this feel like a management gap? It
does. I don't think all of the bishops are each in charge of dioceses. That seems mathematically impossible here.
Right. There's like education ones, right? That was what Frank did.
Right.
They do other things, but it just feels like take 400 of those bishops and give them to the parishes.
That seems like a good fix.
And you'd still have...
Stop over-promoting. I'm curious how many of these bishops were promoted to pull them out of a sticky situation.
Probably more than
you want. Yes, for sure.
more than you care to know. And then lastly, maybe and most importantly, we have the Pope, and he is the Bishop of Rome.
Yeah. So instead of being an archbishop, he's elevated above that. He's elevated above cardinal. He's
Pope.
Top.
He also gets a whole bunch of other fun titles with being Pope.
Go for it.
Vicar of Jesus Christ. Successor of the Prince of the Apostles. Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church. Patriarch of the Latin Church. Primate of Italy. Archbishop and Metropolitan of the Roman province. Sovereign of the Vatican City-State. And servant of the servants of God.
See, I like the last one.
I do too. It's like King of Kings, right? The servant of the servants. You're actually at the bottom.
Right. It was. That's what Jesus said, is that if you want to be the boss, you got to be a servant. Servant leadership is a good thing. I also like this primate of Italy. I just think of King Kong shaking his hands in the Italian way.
Climbing that's why the Leaning Tower of Pisa leans. Oh no.
Like the new names given to Jesus' original 12 apostles, popes often give themselves new names. Jorge Mario Bergoglio chose Francis. He's the first guy to do so, current pope. After Francis of Assisi, then we also have a dozen popes who decided to call themselves pious. I can't imagine getting away with me asking people to call me pious. It's a weird name to give yourself. We had 13 insist on being called innocent. I don't know if they're like feeling guilty about stuff and they just need to be reassured by their friends that they're innocent.
I immediately think of the Fred Armisen meme. I'm just a baby. I don't have any money. I could pay you in blocks. Like, that's literally what I think of with Vera Pope innocent. I don't have any money, but I could pay you in blocks.
And we had 9 popes choose to be called Lucky. Pope Lucky.
Cute.
I mean, actually, they were Pope Boniface, but that's just Latin for lucky.
That's cute.
Right?
That's cute. I like that.
And so we've had loads and loads of popes over just shy of 2,000 years of history, but we've also had dozens of anti-popes.
Is this like there was one time 3 popes?
Yeah.
And 2 of them weren't official.
So anybody who came really close to being pope, but like lost the election, but still insisted that they were pope, is basically...
That hits way too close to home.
Right?
Interrupted.
There's a reason that it got worded that way. We got 42 anti-popes in the official history. There are some figures that are kind of fuzzy on the pope anti-pope dichotomy, which is also interesting. And maybe this deserves a whole extra discussion all on its own, but we're very limited on time. So these are men who not only stood in opposition to those whom the Church of Rome insisted were the genuinely elected heads of the church, but they also had serious support from sizable factions within the church for various reasons, often legitimate reasons. We had a good handful of them were supported by emperors. There can be good and bad reasons to that. The first was Natalius. He was a heretic who did eventually return begging the legitimate pope for forgiveness, but it's interesting. And honestly, there's a few that did that. But Natalius was the first. And then the last anti-pope we had was in 1449, Felix V. Felix is another good name. It just means happy.
Pious, innocent, lucky, and happy.
Yeah.
I love it. Are these
dwarfs?
Yes. Is there a sleepy pope or a dopey pope?
Maybe. Sleepy could be Clement. I don't know.
Okay. One thing I wanted to touch on is the Holy See. And this is actually really confusing. And I've had like documentaries try to explain it to me, and I'm frequently confused. So I'm going to do my best to explain what I don't know to you. So it's really important to remember that Vatican City is an independent nation inside of Rome, inside of Italy. It's like a little Matryoshka doll of countries.
Sure.
And this is where things get complicated. So the Holy See is the jurisdiction of the Pope and is subject to international laws just like any other country.
Mm-hmm.
The capital of the Holy See is Vatican City, which takes up the entire land area of the Holy See. So we have two things that are exactly, we have a country and a city, and they're the exact same size.
Yeah.
And the official language is Latin, which is actually pretty cool for Latin because it's a dead language. Not that anyone speaks it day to day, but that is what the official language on the CIA fact book about Vatican is.
I feel like it's useful in that way that a lot of these people who have studied to get to this point in their life where they get to live at the Vatican, when they come from other parts in the world, they've been doing a lot of reading in Latin. So Latin is, in a lot of situations, going to be the language they share in common, if not English or more modern Italian.
So the Pope governs three things: the Roman Catholic Church, the Holy See, and the Vatican State. The Holy See, however, governs the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican State as well. So it's very confusing.
It looks weird on a chart, but let's call it transparent accountability. So you've got a lot of people checking each other to make sure that things run smoothly. I feel like that's probably why this really bad collection of arrows works the way it does.
Yes. And so, I mean, the Pope is head of everything, but he has cardinals and advisors that handle government things and church things.
Mm-hmm. He's the CEO, but he can be removed in theory, except he's infallible. And that's been written into law for the last 70 years.
Yes. And that was actually one thing because I think it plays into this Holy See, is fairly recently in Canada, the Pope apologized for residential schools, but he worded it in a way because he and the church are infallible. It was sort of a half-assed apology. It was like, I'm sorry this happened to you, but they didn't accept any blame because the church can, air quotes, do no wrong. And
yeah,
it is very interesting. And then, so there are, like political things and political things as simple as, there's a post office in the Vatican. So that's a government piece of this weird.
Do they have their own post office, or do they get the Italian postal service?
I mean, I'm sure for actual physical delivery, it's the Italian, but you can get your own Vatican City stamps. They are separate from Italian stamps. Okay. And you can get your passport stamped for Vatican.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah. So yes, it is. It functions like a nation, but...
Well, at least it's a functioning nation. Not all of our neighbors can say that much.
Right. And the Swiss Guard are actually all people from Switzerland. You have to be Swiss to be part of the Swiss Guard, which, I mean, I guess, makes sense in the name, but I'm also impressed that there's that many people from Switzerland who want to be guards in the Vatican. And, people elsewhere in the world who'd be like, that sounds like a cool job. And they're like, oh, sorry, bitch, you ain't Swiss.
Right. Because the Swiss are committed to being neutral, mostly for financial reasons. So many world leaders still want to hear from the Pope. The Pope still travels all around the world talking to people all the time. This kind of gives the illusion that the Holy See is still a global imperial power like it was in the Dark Ages, I think. When really it doesn't have to have any power. It's just a dude who claims to hold your salvation in his hands.
I mean, that's just a big philosophical debate there, Preston.
Right.
You could say that about any world leader. He doesn't need to have any power.
Right.
But yeah, I mean,
are we advocating for anarchy?
Anarchy and libertarianism. I mean, it is really interesting. I mean, it wasn't terribly long ago that Francis was elected Pope. And, you see everyone flocks all of a sudden to Italy, and everyone wants to see the white smoke, and there's flags from all over the world there. And, it just blows my mind that, people... And I guess the Shroud of Turin comes out this summer as well in Italy.
We've talked about this before.
I know,
but
nonsense. I know it is, but it just blows my mind that people from all over the world, it's that important. I mean, we talked about this on Heaven's Gate. That something is so important to someone.
Right.
It's kind of wild.
Well, and the Catholic Church today boasts about 1.4 billion members globally, out of 8 billion. That's a massive chunk of the global population.
And I think because we are in such a Protestant part of the world, we forget how prominent Catholicism is. And I know even You hear it occasionally. Maybe this is partially because they do separate themselves in terms of Catholic schools, but like, oh, they're not Christian, or they're a different Christian, or they're kind of, on their own. Then, in the last 2 years, we went to Ireland and Portugal, and it doesn't get much more Catholic than either of those places.
Sure.
When you realize how prominent this is still as a religion.
Oh, yeah. Out of that 1.4 billion people, they're about as diverse as any other group of people of that size could ever be. Politically, piety, everything about them, it's impossible to call it a monolithic thing. And so there's a lot of nuance to all of the things.
If I ever talked about the town of Knock on the podcast, this feels like an appropriate one to talk about it.
Tell me more.
So it's this little town in Ireland. Mm-hmm. And in just the turn of the century, 18-something, there was a Marian apparition in Knock.
Okay.
Mary appeared to the people. And I think Jesus, but a lamb.
So Mary had a little lamb.
Mary had a little lamb.
Okay.
And anyway, to this day, 100 plus years later, it's their entire identity. When you tell your parents frogs, and then that's it for the rest of your life. That's Knock with Mary.
Okay.
And I made my husband drive through Knock. It was a bit of a detour. I was like, you have to see it, because I drove through it over a decade ago. And I just drove through it, but we actually got out of our car and walked around a bit. And I want you to it's a small town. So not a crazy strip, not the Vegas strip, but everyone kind of has that downtown shopping area in there, but small. Mm-hmm. The main street of a town. But every shop that is a tourist shop has to do with Jesus. It's the wildest thing you've ever seen.
Not Mary?
Well, Jesus and Mary, and weirdly Pope Pius, the one with the stigmas.
Okay.
The one I think before John Paul.
Okay.
Everything has to do with one of those three people. But just imagine, I don't want to dox us, but that avenue in our town, every shop is a religious shop. And you could get water bottles for holy water in the shape of Pope Pius. You could anything you can imagine. You want a pillow with Jesus's face on it? Wrap it up. You want a laptop cover with Mary on it? Wrap it up. You want a different shaped water bottle for your holy water? Let's do it.
Sounds like a trip.
Isn't this the weirdest place you've ever been? Because that probably didn't pick up the first time. Not. They're just very passionate. And I think, and I couldn't find the dates, but I think there's a pilgrimage there because...
Makes sense that there would be.
But there was so much parking space and nobody was around. So my guess is that there must be a time of year. And then there was also a whole bunch of shops that just weren't open. Mm-hmm. They looked very seasonal. And so my guess is that there's a big fucking pilgrimage at one point, because it was it's like going to shopping, a shopping mall level parking in a tiny little town.
Okay.
I was like, why is there so much parking?
Fun.
Anyway, Catholics, cataholics, as I like to call them.
We do have on our shop a catholic shirt. Well, it's not just on shirts; it's on all sorts of stuff. Yeah,
whatever you want to be a cataholic for.
Be sure to check out this great diagram and other great content on our Discord. Also, check us out on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. And like we mentioned, we've got merch on Spreadshop. We've got our Patreon, where you can support us financially and maybe even join the San Lenatus Fellowship.
Yeah, if you need more structure in your life as we descended to anarchy and libertarianism, you can follow us.
Yeah.
Let us be your leaders.
Thanks for joining us.
Peace be with you.
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.